Good afternoon. My name is Mike Abbott, and this is my persuasive speech for Communications A111. The topic of my speech is professional athletes and how our children shouldn't consider them positive role models. 2013 has been a pretty bad year for the NFL. They've had 30 players who've been arrested since the Super Bowl, and these charges have varied from disorderly conduct to DUI to domestic violence. And probably most notably in the news right now is the case involving Aaron Hernandez, who was arrested for murdering a semi-pro player. Now, the NFL isn't the only pro organization that has had image issues involving the players. Lance Armstrong gave cycling a black eye or two. You got NBA's Meta World Peace, of whom is a prime example of who we don't want our kids to grow up and be like. And baseball has got steroids. I mean, lots and lots of steroids. That being said, children still look up to professional athletes. They always have. What these individuals can do in their sport is nothing short of amazing. It really isn't. And that's not the issue. The issue is how these players behave off the field. It's these behaviors that define these athletes as positive or negative role models. So over the next few minutes, we're going to take a look at what a positive role model is and the traits that one should exhibit, as well as discuss, that athletes have always been misbehaving. This isn't a real new problem, and you're going to see that in a few of the examples that I'm going to show you. And finally, we're going to take a look at some things that we can do as parents to help our children in choosing good role models. So what is a positive role model, anyway? Well, Merriam-Webster's dictionary defines a role model as a person whose behavior in a particular role is imitated by others. And the word positive is defined as having a good effect. So, I suppose a positive role model is someone whose actions would be considered favorable. And me personally, as a parent, I wouldn't mind at all if my child is exhibiting some of these behaviors of a positive role model. So what attributes or characteristics do we want our kids to be imitating? What attributes or characteristics make up a positive role model? So, of course, this is debatable, as favorable attributes differ from family to family. But I think we're pretty safe in saying that generosity, courage, and honesty are all traits that we want our children to exhibit. And so, unfortunately, these professional athletes has never been the best at demonstrating these traits. Many think that athletes have only recently started misbehaving, acting up, if you will, but that's just not the case. So let's take a look at a few athletes from over the years that exhibited less than stellar decision-making abilities. The late 1800s gave us a fellow by the name of Cap Anson. He was the first player to reach 3,000 hits in his professional career, ranging from 1871 to 1897. And then because of this stat, he was considered to be one of the first superstars of baseball. Now, unfortunately, all of this on-field accomplishments that he had, being a fantastic hitter, he had a real long career, all of that stuff was overshadowed by his extreme racism that he made very public. In fact, Anson's influence on the league played a huge role on keeping baseball segregated well into the 1940s. Now, the early 1900s gave us the Sultan of SWAT. And he is considered by many to be the best baseball player that the sport has ever seen, with a career batting average of 342 and a total of 714 homers, a plethora of honors from the league, and not to mention being part of the first class inducted into the Hall of Fame. Now, while on the field, Babe Ruth was one of the greatest. Now, off the field, he did live up the life of the roaring 20s with lots of high-profile partying and very reckless behavior. In fact, he had a high-speed car wreck that nearly killed his wife, his coach, his coach's wife, and even himself. And, these things made the newspapers, kids saw it, and just isn't a behavior that we really want our kids to see and look up to. The 2000s gave us a fellow by the name of Tiger Woods. Now, Tiger was considered by many to be the greatest golfer ever. He was directly responsible for increasing the popularity of the sport. He was young, he was half Thai, half black, and he took chances. Very much not your typical golfer. Foundations were set up in his name. He was a philanthropist and a dedicated family man. He was considered somebody that we could have our kids look up to, both on the field and off. Tiger was a true role model. until November of 2009, when the Tiger legacy completely fell apart, when all of his sexual transgressions came out for his family and then eventually the public to see. And this is not exactly what anybody would consider to be positive role model behavior. Many athletes are aware that their actions aren't quite up to snuff. Prime example is in a Nike commercial from the early 1990s. Charles Barkley, a professional basketball player, said, "I am not a role model. Just because I can dunk a basketball doesn't mean I should raise your kids." This statement is true. The ability to dunk a basketball does not qualify Sir Charles to raise our kids. But another famous basketball responded to this quote, saying, from one role model to another, "Charles, you can deny being a role model all you want, but I don't think it's your decision to make. We don't choose to be role models. We are chosen. Our only choice is whether to be a good role model or a bad one." Now, this is a fantastic quote that Karl Malone gave in an issue of Sports Illustrated back in July of 1993. And it just goes to show that, this is a decision that these guys are making. These behaviors that they do off the field, it's either they care about being somebody these kids look up to, or they don't. And of course, not all athletes are terrible role models. We have a fellow by the name of John Cena, who is right now the current WWE reigning world champion. Now, whether or not professional wrestling is a legitimate sport is debatable, but kids still look up to these guys in the same way they look up to professional football players. And, John Cena, he's granted well over 300 wishes for the Make-A-Wish Foundation for, kids that are dying and their wishes to meet John Cena or go to Disney World or something. I mean, he puts a lot of money into it, a lot of time, and he never says no. And he's just a fantastic individual, and it's hard to find anything negative about the guy, but you also don't read a lot about him in the newspapers. You're not going to read about John Cena so much. You're going to read about the Ron Artests of the world. You're going to read about Tiger Woods on the front page of everything. And, unfortunately, the media typically goes after the bad news and not so much the good news. But there are positive role models out there. So what can we do as parents to sway our kids to actually look towards these positive role models instead of the more negative role models? Kids are going to look up to these athletes. They always have, and they always will. And I'll even admit that there's something larger than life about people like Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa. And even though I'm an adult, I can still get drawn into the awesomeness of the feats that these pros are capable of, and become willing to ignore their off-field antics. But being a parent, I can't allow myself to do that. I can't allow myself to turn a blind eye to the poor behavior of these professional athletes, because after all, kids do look up to their parents. And if my child sees me, ignoring the sexual transgressions of Tiger Woods, for example, because he's such a good golfer, I'm just going to overlook that and move on to the next thing. My children are going to do the same thing. And we owe it to our kids to encourage them to pick more positive role models for them to imitate as they grow up and become contributing members of society. Now, we need to help our kids in choosing these positive role models by openly expressing how we feel about the negative behaviors of some of these athletes. They're getting arrested or they're out having adulterous relationships. We need to be vocal about it with our children and let them know that we don't approve of this behavior, because after all, I said earlier, kids do look up to us and they do respect what we say and how we feel about things. And at the same time, we also need to be able to let the children know whenever an athlete or a celebrity does something positive, does something good, and it doesn't even have to be a celebrity or an athlete. It can be somebody in the local community or in the schools or a coach or even another player on the kids' team. Whenever they do something positive, we make sure that everybody knows that we've seen it and that we think that it is a positive behavior. So in this presentation, we've taken a look at what defines a good role model and how professional athletes don't quite measure up to the definition. And we also saw how athletes have always provided some kind of subpar examples of good behavior, and we finished up with some ways that parents can influence their children to make wise role model choices. Now, looking up to athletes for inspiration on the field can be beneficial to excel in a sport, but it's when kids begin to imitate the off-field behavior of the sports heroes that trouble can begin happening.